All right, good morning, everybody. If you would find a place to sit, and as you find your seat, let me invite you all to turn to the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11. We have been going through Daniel for several months now, and I believe we will finish the book next week. It seems like it hasn't been that long, but this morning we're going to be in a large portion of the text, and I'll explain why. We're going to be in verses 1 through 35. Daniel chapter 11, 1 to 35. The title of the sermon this morning is History is Written in God's Book. And I'll read the text as I go through it in the exposition, just for time's sake, because it's such a large text. So if you will, open and join me in opening in prayer as we ask God to bless this time and to give us understanding of His Word. Father, this morning as we come to a text that is filled with just so much history, and I think as we will all see, it's very confusing and difficult to understand and how to put the pieces together. I pray that you would give us understanding, God. You have said that you have given us your Holy Spirit to understand all things that pertain to godliness. And we pray, Lord, that you would give us that understanding through the Spirit this morning. Help me, Lord, as I preach to speak with clarity, and help us to see, God, that all history is already written. You've already written the story, and it's recorded in your book. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. As I was preparing the sermon this week, I had great difficulty, like capital G, great difficulty, tracking the history and the events of this chapter. And so I imagine you will have even more difficulty tracking my tracking. I fully understand that the sermon this morning is going to, for half of it, if not more than half, is going to seem like a boring high school history lesson. I know that most of us don't like history. It probably is very few of our favorite subjects in high school. But I want to challenge us all. Remember that all Scripture, as Paul says in 2 Timothy, all Scripture is profitable. All of it is profitable for teaching and training and correction. And so, including Daniel chapter 11. And so, part of the problem with the text, with our understanding of the text this morning, is that there are 19 different rulers that are mentioned in this chapter. 19. It's a lot. And so in just a few minutes, I'm going to show a graph for visual aid to kind of help us to see this. And you can obviously request the PowerPoint for that graph if you like after the sermon. So let me give the context, and then we'll read the text as exposition, and I'll give application. So here's the context. Here's where we're at. It is the third year of Darius the Mede, the ruler of Persia, whom I have argued is the same as Cyrus the Great. I think Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Great are the same person. They're two different names. Daniel has been mourning and fasting for 3 weeks. We looked at that last week. And then he's given a vision where he sees this figure. And I argued last week that I think it's the pre-incarnate Christ that he sees, that we looked at last week. The vision saps Daniel of all strength, but a heavenly messenger is sent to Daniel to give him strength, to strengthen him to be able to receive it. And so what we looked at last week, chapter 10, all of that was simply preparation. All of chapter 10 is essentially preparing Daniel to receive this vision that is given in chapters 11 and chapter 12. Really, chapter 11 and 12 are just one giant vision that is given to Daniel. And God has prepared him to receive this. He's now been strengthened. He's now ready to receive the vision. And that's where we pick up this morning. Last week, we left off on chapter 10, verse 20. And so this morning, I'm going to pick up in chapter 10, verse 21. And I'm going to read to chapter 11, verse 2a. So if you'll follow along with me, chapter 10, beginning in verse 21, here's what how the text reads. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and to strengthen him. And now I will show you the truth. Now, when I read this initially and I saw that it was the first year of Darius the Mede, I was so confused because I'm like, wait, I thought we were in the third year of Darius the Mede. How are we now back in the first year? And I spent an hour of my life trying to figure this out. And I finally figured it out, I think, by looking simply at the NIV. I was reading all these commentators and I just needed to look at the NIV. I think the NIV is correct here. I'm going to show it to you on the PowerPoint, just so for your sake, to make sense of this. But first, I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. Start of parenthetical. No one supports me except Michael, your prince. And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. End parenthetical. Now then, I tell you the truth. And so what the NIV is bringing out here is that it is the third year of Darius the Mede. The angel is saying that no one supports him except Michael. Remember last week we looked at Michael. There's this war going on in heaven. And these angels are fighting with demons. And it's a heavenly war. And he says, whoever this angel is, no one helped him except Michael. And he takes the time to say that I also helped Michael in the first year of Darius the Mede. So he's just kind of talking about a previous time that he helped Michael, and now 2 years later, Michael is helping him. So I think that's how to make sense of it. So that took me an hour to figure that out, but that's how I think we should read that. Let's look at verse 2 to 4. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against all the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with a great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So, in this vision, the angel says to Daniel that after Cyrus, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, the 4th of them being richer than all the other 3. Let me show this to you just again for your visual sake. The first after Cyrus is Cambyses. The second is Smyrtus. Third is Darius the first. The 4th is Xerxes. Xerxes is the one who is richer than all the others. And then he says that a mighty king shall arise with great dominion and rule. This mighty king is none other than Alexander the Great. So the angel is essentially telling Daniel about who these kings are going to be after Cyrus. Alexander the Great, we remember him. He is the goat in chapter 8. Remember the ram and the goat in chapter 8. He's the goat in chapter 8. And notice it says here that his kingdom is going to be broken and divided it toward the 4 winds. If you remember, Alexander had conquered the known world at this time in less than 10 years. But he suddenly died at the age of 32 in 323 BC. After he died, his empire was divided into 4 sections. The text says that it will not go to his posterity. Posterity means his genealogy, his descendants. Meaning, why? Because his sons are murdered. Alexander's sons are murdered, and they don't inherit the empire. And so it gets divided into 4 sections. Look at verse 5 to 6. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of its princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years, they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. Now we're going to enter in verses 5 to 20. They're going to describe an ongoing conflict between 2 kingdoms, known in the text as the north and the south. Let me show this to you again to explain what's going on here. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, I guess you can see that. The south, if you will see here, is the Ptolemies. It's Egypt. And these are the kings that are in the text. The north is the Seleucids, or Syria. These are the kings that serve the north. These two empires who inherit, remember it was divided into 4 sections, but really 2 become prominent. And the whole rest of the text in verse 5 to 20 is going to describe this conflict between these 2 empires, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. All right, so if you ever have trouble remembering that, the way I remember it is Ptolemy starts with a P, Pharaoh, Egypt, Seleucid, Syria, S, whatever way you can remember who's north, who's south. Look at verse 6 here. It says, after some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So I'm going to use my laser pointer just so you guys can track, because again, I tried tracking this when I was reading it. I was like, I am so where am I? Ptolemy the second, so this king right here, makes a treaty of peace with the Seleucid ruler Antiochus the second. This guy right here makes an alliance with him about 250 BC. What happens is Bernice, Ptolemy's daughter, was to marry Antiochus to seal the alliance between these 2 kingdoms. Her son was then to become the Seleucid heir to the throne, right? We even see that this happens all the time in history, right? Where you give your daughter and you hope that by them being married that it'll kind of extend relations or maybe take the throne. The problem is that Antiochus II, right here, he was already married to a powerful and influential woman named Laodice, who succeeded in murdering Antiochus and Bernice and their child. She's an evil woman. So it didn't work. Let's look at verse 7 to 9. And from a branch, from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images, their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the kings of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So here's what's happening in verses 7 to 9. Ptolemy the third, so right here, Ptolemy the third, in retaliation for his sister's murder, for Bernice's murder, remember, by Laodice. In retaliation, Ptolemy the third attacks Syria with a great army. Now this war lasts from 246 to 241 BC. Ptolemy captures and eluded the Syrian capital, the Seleucid capital of Antioch. And he puts Laodice to death, right? She murdered his sister. He murders her. He returns home to Egypt with great spoil. It says here, notice he returns home with precious vessels of silver and gold. He returns home with all this spoil. And then Ptolemy makes a peace treaty with Seleucid. I don't know. Which one are we at here? We're at the second here. This one right here. Makes a peace treaty in 240 BC. And at a later time, the Syrian king will try to make war on the Egyptian king, but he's going to fail. All right. Let's look at verse 10 to 13. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted. He shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first. And after some years, he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. So here's what's happening in verses 10 to 13. This ruler right here, and Antiochus the third, these two guys right here are going to continue the wars against the Ptolemies. The northern king's sons, they create this large army and they attack the southern king's fortress. Ptolemy IV, right here, is infuriated. He can't stand that they're coming to attack him. So he marches out to fight them, and Ptolemy actually wins the battle. As a result of winning the battle, it says in verse 12 that his heart becomes exalted. In other words, he becomes arrogant that he's won the battle. His army kills thousands and thousands, but his victories do not continue. Why? Because according to verse 13, when it says that he shall come on a great army, where am I at here? Approximately 15 years later, Antiochus III, right here, invades the Ptolemaic territories with a huge army, and he wins the army. So in other words, Ptolemy initially wins the initial battle, but when they come again, he loses, and Antiochus wins. Let's look at verse 14 to 19. In those times, many shall arise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands. He shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So here's what's happening in verses 14 to 19. Many people are going to rise up against the king of the south, including some of the Jews. It says here in the text that the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. In other words, the Jews begin to think that they can make this vision happen. They can bring it to pass, but they fail. They fail. Then the king of the north will come against the king of the south and will be successful. Why? Because there's no strength in the southern king. In other words, the northern king will do as he wills. No one can withstand him. He will take up residence in the glorious land. Notice it says there that he'll take up residence in the glorious land. That's a reference to Israel. He will have destruction in his hand, meaning he will have the power to destroy all of Israel if he wants. Antiochus, the invader, acquired complete control over Phoenicia and Palestine. Now, here's what's interesting is that the Jews looked upon him as a deliverer, as a benefactor. They were so happy that he came in and defeated the Ptolemies. They were like, yay, we like you. That's going to be a mistake. We'll see in just a minute. In verse 17, it says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom. He shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So here's what happens here. The northern king gives terms of agreement. Antiochus gave his daughter Cleopatra, not the same Cleopatra, gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V as a wife. But it doesn't work. Why? Because Cleopatra loved her husband and she supported the Ptolemaic cause completely. After this, the northern king decides to take on the coastlands, which usually refers to the Mediterranean, but a commander from the coastlands, as we see in the text here, a commander shall put an end to his insolence in verse 18. What does this mean? In 191 BC, the Romans, fighting with their Greek allies, they rout the Syrians at Thermopylae and force them to withdraw from Greece. The northern king is forced to return home. The text, it says in verse 19, he shall stumble, he shall fall, and he shall not be found. Why? Because when he returns home, he's killed by an angry mob in 187 BC. Look at verse 20 to 28. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. He shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. He shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a short time. He shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plot shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for their end is yet to be at the appointed time. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set up against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So here's what's happening in verses 20 to 28. And when it says that he's going to send an exactor of tribute, that means he's going to go send for taxes. He demands payment. This exactor of tribute is this guy right here, Seleucus the fourth. And he sends Heliodorus, his tax collector, his prime minister, to go seek tribute. But it's a trap. He seeks to gain the throne for himself, and he poisons the king. Verse 21, in place of him, who arises after him? None other than Antiochus the fourth. We've seen him before. Antiochus the fourth. Antiochus the fourth is the contemptible person in verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person. This is none other than Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes, the little horn of chapter 8. Remember in chapter 8 we looked at the little horn? That's who this is. He says that royal majesty has not been given to him. In other words, the throne rightfully belonged to Demetrius Soter, the son. His son should have gone to the throne, but he doesn't. Why? Because his son is detained in Rome. He's under house arrest or in prison in Rome. So Antiochus seizes the throne for himself. He comes in without warning, and he obtains the kingdom by flatteries. What does that mean? It means he came to them in a time of false security. They thought they were safe. They thought they were secure. Antiochus invades the richest province and plunders their treasures. These include the areas of Egypt and Judea. And in verse 25, when it says, he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south, win a great army. This is referring to Ptolemy the sixth. Last one here. He wages war against Antiochus the fourth, but he loses. Why? Because he's betrayed by his closest men. It says that he was betrayed by even those who ate at his table. His brother, Ptolemy the seventh, becomes king. Now, Ptolemy is called the Prince of the Covenant. When it says here that he will, the Prince of the Covenant, because he agreed. What ends up happening here is that Ptolemy agrees to become an ally of Antiochus if the Syrians will help him regain his throne in Egypt. In verse 27, Ptolemy the sixth and Antiochus, they make a plan. How are they going to regain the throne in Egypt? Both kings make promises that they had no intention of keeping, but it doesn't matter. It says that's what it means when it says they lie, right? It doesn't matter. Why? Because God has an appointed time for both of them. In verse 28, he shall return with great wealth, and his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. So what happens is that after plundering Egypt, Antiochus returns home and he goes through Palestine, right? He's got to go through Palestine to go back home. And when he gets to Palestine, he finds an insurrection is in progress. What does he do? He puts down the rebellion. He massacres 80,000 men, women, and children. And then he loots the temple with the help of an evil high priest. Look at verse 29 to 31. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him. He shall be afraid and withdraw. He shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So what's happening here is that 2 years later, in 168 BC, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, he forms a second campaign against Egypt. So he goes down to attack Egypt again. It worked once. He defeated them once. Let me do it again. Here's the problem, though. Egypt reaches out to who? To Rome. When it says ships from Kittim, that's Rome. The Roman fleet comes to Alexandria at the request of the Ptolemies. The Roman commander meets Antiochus. He hands him a letter from the Roman Senate ordering him to leave Egypt or face war with Rome. Now, Antiochus has heard about how powerful Rome is becoming. He thinks twice. The Roman commander actually, on the beaches, draws a circle around Antiochus in the sand. And he tells Antiochus, you must decide what you're going to do before leaving this circle. In other words, if you don't, you're dead. Antiochus thinks about it, and he realizes he doesn't want to cross Rome. So he returns home. He returns home in utter humiliation. Now, why is this important? Because Antiochus is going to turn his humiliation into anger. He's going to take out his anger. Who's going to take out his anger against? The people of God. He sends Apollonius to collect tribute from Jerusalem. Apollonius comes to Jerusalem to collect tribute, but he pretends like he's coming in peace. But on the Sabbath day, he suddenly attacked, massacres many people, and he plunders the city. In verse 31, when it says that he shall take away the regular burnt offering, set up the abomination that makes desolate, what's going on there? In 167 BC, an altar is devoted to Zeus in the temple. He erects an altar in the temple to Zeus, and he offers sacrifices, including swine, on the altar. This is the abomination that makes desolate. Let's look at verse 32 to 35. This will be the last of our text. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So what happens here is that Antiochus, when he goes into Jerusalem, he seduces with flattery those who are not true followers of Yahweh. He finds these people who are kind of straddling the fence, and he seduces them. They join him. They welcome him. But the text says that those who know their God shall stand firm, and they shall take action. Now that is most likely a reference to the Maccabean revolt. You may have heard of that before, the Maccabean revolt. If you want to read about that, you can read about that in the Apocrypha. The wise make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. What does that mean? It means they're persecuted. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in this persecution. Now, while they are being persecuted, they receive a little help. But many will unite with them with flattery. What does that mean? It means many of the Jews will unite the revolt, but they're only doing it for like false motives. They're doing it insincerely, deceitfully. Now, why does God allow this persecution? Why would God allow this? The text tells us, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. We'll stop there with our text. Yes, all of that will be on your test. Now, how do you get application from a text like this? Don't attack people. What do you do with this? I have 6, maybe 7, I can't remember. I have 6 points of application. Number 1, human history has already been written, and God has the book on his shelf. Human history has already been written, and God has the book on his shelf. The angel tells Daniel in chapter 10, verse 21, but I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. And what does that mean? What is inscribed in the book of truth? The Bible talks about God keeping books. Let me show you a few examples, or tell you a few examples. Psalm 56:8, you have kept count of my tossings. You have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not written in your book? Psalm 69:28, let them be blotted out from the book of the living. Psalm 139:16, in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me. And then Revelation 20:12, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. Human history has already been written. Notice the tense of the verb here. He says, I will tell you what is inscribed, not what is being inscribed, not what will be inscribed, but I will tell you what is already inscribed in my book. Human history has already been written, and God has the book on his shelf. Now, this is true on a macro level. It's also true on a micro level. Meaning God has already written the history for all nations. Who is going to win the Russian-Ukraine war? God has already decided. It's already been decided. Will China invade Taiwan or not? It's already been decided. Which country will be the dominant superpower in 21-23 or 22-23? God has already decided. That's true on the macro level, and it's true on the micro level, meaning God has written your story and my story. It's already been written. You know, I really struggled with this chapter, right? And maybe you struggled listening to this chapter, listening to me. I struggled with it. I'm like, how does this apply to my life? Right? Like out of everything, you know, God, there's so many other questions I have, and yet you spent like a whole chapter to talk about all these wars. How does this apply to my life? And as I was going through this week, you know, it was like so tedious going through all these details and you know, figuring all this out. And I'm just like, why am I doing this? And then I stopped and I considered how amazing this is. That God is able to give all these details. Think about it. This prophecy is not going to be fulfilled for like 300 to 400 years. And yet when God gives this this is probably the most detailed prophecy in all the Bible. Seriously. I mean, God is able to give details down to specific alliances and specific battles that are won, and specific marriages that will happen, and who's going to help who, and what king will come, and when they will come, and who will win that battle, and what order is all of it going to happen. All of this comes true. Historically, we know that all this comes true. And and there's a part of you wish that we could get this prophecy for our own life, right? Like, wouldn't it be amazing if God would say, okay, Matt, here's what's going to happen in 2024. And God would detail out, here's what's going to happen in 2034. Here's what's going to happen in 2044. Wouldn't it be amazing? But God doesn't give us that. He doesn't give us that. What he does give us is this. He gives us an assurance that human history has already been written. And he has the book on his shelf. There is a great comfort in knowing that your story and my story, it's already been written. It's already been written. God is not discovering our story the way that we are discovering our story. God is not a reader of history. He is the author of it. Now, why is this important? Because we try so hard to make our life turn out the way that we want, right? Don't we? Don't we? We strive so hard to make sure our life turns out exactly as we want it to turn out. And which is no different than these kings, isn't it? These kings are trying so hard to make their kingdom turn out the way that they want. And we can forget that God's already written our story. Doesn't life so rarely turn out the way that we think it will? Doesn't life so rarely turn out exactly as we want it to turn out? So rest. Friend, you can go to bed tonight and every night hereafter knowing that your story has already been written. Now, I'm not preaching fatalism. Not to be like, well, my story's already been written, I'm preaching a peace, an assurance that you don't have to strive like these kings to make your life turn out a certain way. God's already determined how your life is going to turn out. 2, pride comes before a fall, so fall before pride comes. Pride comes before a fall, so fall before pride comes. As I was reading these battles and these wars and these regime changes, right? I mean, when I was reading this, I don't know what your takeaway was, but like one of my main takeaways was this. It's such a rat race for power, right? Like you look at all these kings and it's like, it's just this giant rat race. They're all striving for power and control. This king attacked this king and he failed. And so he goes back home with his tail tucked between his legs. And then he's like, I'm going to fortify my forces. And then he attacks again and then he wins. And then when he wins, he gets prideful. And then the defeated king is like, oh no, he's not. I'm going to attack him again. I'm going to fortify my forces. And then he goes and attacks him. And it's just back and forth and back and forth. All for what? For what? For pride. Pride. There's a little phrase that's tucked away in verse 12. Did you see it? And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted. The southern king is so proud that he finally won the victory. He's so proud of his victories. And then 15 years later, he falls. Assyria was so proud only to fall to Babylon. Babylon was so proud only to fall to Persia. Persia, the ram, was so proud only to fall to Greece, the goat. Greece was so proud only to fall to Rome. Rome was so proud only to fall to themselves. It's the same story over and over and over again. It never changes. Pride comes before a fall, so fall before pride comes. Now, we read this story, and these are worldly leaders. They're vying for power. They're vying for worldly kingdoms. Yes, and you're like, well, I'm not a worldly leader. I'm not a king. But we're not immune from the same temptation to pride, are we not? We're not immune from this. Pride in our career. Pride in our, you make it, right? You got that manager position in Amazon or Google or Microsoft. Now what? Now what? Pride in our talent and our success. Pride in our possessions and our assets. Pride in our children's success. Pride in our ministry. God has said that pride comes before a fall. So fall. Fall before pride comes. Fall on your face and humble yourself. Listen to me. Don't believe the lie that you have to join the world in this endless rat race. I know that's what the world's taught you. It's what school teaches you. It's what your parents teach you. It's what society teaches you. It's that there's this endless rat race and you have to be successful. You have to make 6 figures. You have to get a $2 million retirement. You have to get a house. You have to achieve this and this and this. For what? It's the same story over and over again. No different than this. We all die. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. It is better to be humble than successful. And for all of you, it's not exclusive. You can be both. I know that's what some of you are thinking. 3. This is a quote from Joyce Baldwin, who's a commentator. God does not plan a political utopia, even for his people. God does not plan a political utopia, even for his people. God called Abraham out of the land of Babylon to the promised land. They enjoyed a time of peace and prosperity. But then they were in exile in Egypt for 400 years. God eventually rescued them out of Egypt and brought them into the promised land. They enjoyed tremendous prosperity under David and tremendous peace and prosperity under Solomon. However, this was short-lived. Because of their sin, the nation was split into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom was carried off into exile by Assyria, never to return. The southern kingdom was then carried off into exile by Babylon. Just as God rescued his people from Egypt, God rescues them from Babylon. The exiles return home. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the walls. And it appears the glory days are coming back. We made it, guys. We got out of Babylon. We're back home. Temple's rebuilt. The walls are rebuilt. The glory days of Solomon are coming back. But that's not what happens. It's not what happens. Why? Because God, for a few hundred years, has Israel sandwiched in between these 2 rival kingdoms. Syria is to the north. Egypt is to the south. What's right in between those? Israel. God has his people sandwiched in between this war between these 2 nations. Now, this seemingly endless battle that goes on for hundreds of years, it culminates with Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. God ordains persecution for his people. Now, why does God do this? Why does God bring persecution to his people? There are many reasons. But one reason is this, because God does not plan a political utopia, even for his people. There are many professing Christians who want America to be the promised land, who basically want America to be a Garden of Eden existence with a little bit of sin, right? Okay, I get we can't have Garden of Eden. We have sin. But I'd like something as close to the Garden of Eden with just a little bit of sin mixed in. But I certainly do not want the depravity that I see in our nation today, right? You look out, you just see massive depravity. And it's like, I do not want this. Now, listen, of course, I selfishly want that too. Of course, I want that too. But I am reminded that God does not desire a political utopia, a nationalistic utopia, a conservative utopia. And you may say, well, we're not fighting wars here in America with other foreign nations. You're right, we're not really. That doesn't mean we're not at war with ourselves. America is far more synonymous or parallels Rome than anything. We're at war with ourselves. What does that mean? I fear that this statement gets so redundant that we dismiss it, right? I mean, sometimes I dismiss it because it's so redundant, but the reason that I keep saying it is because no matter how many times I hear this, I always need to be reminded of it. This is not our home. This is not our home. Whether we are living in Babylon or living in Israel, we are always exiles on this earth. This whole earth is an exile. This is not our home. 4, God is unimaginably active in our world. God is unimaginably active in our world. There are two doctrines when it comes to God's involvement in our world. Two extreme doctrines when it comes to, well, not extremes. One's an extreme, the other one's not. There are two doctrines when it comes to God's involvement in our world. One is providence, the other is deism. Providence is the doctrine that God has purpose in sovereignly ordaining every single event in history down to every single molecule. Those who hold to the doctrine of providence believe that everything that happens, God sovereignly is in control of it. He's ordaining every single thing down to every single molecule. The other doctrine is called deism. Deism is a philosophical view that posits God as a creator who sets the universe in motion, and then he stepped back, no longer active in his creation. Sometimes called the watchmaker, right? God winds the watch, and then it just slowly unwinds. This world is just slowly unwinding. God's not actively involved. That's called deism. Why? You say, why are you telling me this? Here's why. I find that many Christians align themselves theologically with providence, but they practically live like they're a deist. It's difficult not to slip into deism, isn't it? Like on a daily basis when we live our lives, doesn't it feel like what happens is the sum choices of our actions? It's like this happened because this person did this, and this happens because this person did this, and this happens because this person did this. Doesn't it feel like what happens on a daily basis is the sum choices of just personal choices, both yours and mine? We theologically subscribe to providence, but practically many Christians live like they're a deist. And although it's true in some measure that what happens is a result of choice, yes, that's true. I want us to think about this, how much God has to be involved in his creation to make all of this possible. Do you ever think about that? Like when God gives this, remember, this is a prophecy. This won't happen for 300 to 400 years. This is so detailed. How much does God have to be involved to make all this happen? If you were to sit down, I actually thought about doing this, but my head hurt. If you were to sit down and you were to write out all the events in this chapter, like every single event that's referred to here that I just went through, and then you were to branch off all the other events, right? Like, for this war to happen, there needs to be this daughter. She's been married to this man, which means this daughter to be married. The mom and dad have to be here. And then this king has to lose this battle so that it'll happen here. If you were to do that, you would have this exponential effect of all these things that need to happen to bring this about. Right? I mean, he's not just predicting. God's not just saying one thing will happen, right? Can you imagine giving a prophecy that I'm going to give like 30, 40, 60, 70 things in the future that are going to happen over 300 or 400 years? How can you possibly bring all this about? How can God decree that this battle will be won or lost, or this woman will marry this king or not, that they'll have this child, this nation will help this nation? How can God? Because God is unimaginably active in our world. Unimaginably. You know, I think about how many things had to transpire for me to be a Christian. I mean, God could have done it anyway, but how many things had to transpire for me to be a Christian? How many things had to transpire for me to meet my wife? How many things had to transpire for me to have 4 kids? How many things had to transpire for me to be a pastor? I was a terrible kid. I remember in 7th grade, I got voted most Christian. I went to a Christian school, and my teacher was like, Matt? Seriously, that's what she said out loud. Just like that. How many things had to transpire for me to be a pastor at a predominantly Asian church in Seattle? One of the questions that I think about all the time is this: to what degree is God involved? You ever think about that? Like, we all know, like, yeah, I know God is sovereign, but like, to what degree? To what degree is he involved? I know that God ordains all things, but like, what about this red light? Like, did God ordain this red light? And as I sit at the red light, what about that leaf on the sidewalk that's blowing? Is God ordaining that leaf that's blowing? What about the crack in the sidewalk? Is God actively involved in all these things? Yes. Yes. God is unimaginably involved in your life. Unimaginably involved in your life, my life. He is weaving together the threads. 5. Persecution weeds out the waverers. So make sure your roots go deeper than the weeds. Persecution weeds out the waverers. So make sure your roots go deeper than the weeds. In verses 29 to 35, we're given a prophecy of Antiochus IV. He calls himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the enlightened one. The Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes, the madman. He had just suffered a humiliating defeat at the hand of the Romans. And so in response to his humiliation, in verse 28, it says that his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. In verse 30, it says he will be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. Antiochus begins one of the worst persecutions in all of Israel's history. He killed thousands of God's people. And this persecution, what is it going to do? It's going to cause many of God's people to fall away. The text says that he honored those who forsook the covenant. It says he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. Meaning, what does that mean? It means there were those in Israel at this time who were waverers. They're sitting on the fence. They have 1 foot in God's kingdom and 1 foot in man's kingdom. And what happens? Persecution weeds them out. Persecution has always weeded out the waverers. So make sure your roots go deeper than the weeds. This past week or the week before, I had this holly bush in my front yard. I used to have a tree next to the holly bush. It was this big, giant pine tree. And I had to chop it down because my neighbor hacked it to death. It literally looked like, it was like, if you got like half a haircut, that's how that tree looked. It had like half a haircut. And I was like, this looks awful. So I had to cut the tree down. when they cut the tree down, they cut half of the roots of the holly bush. So over time, this holly bush, one side of it was dead and the other side of it was alive. And it just looked. And as I looked at this holly bush, I realized, like, this is such a picture of those who are wavering in their faith. Those who are sitting on the fence. I kept waiting. I honestly, I kept waiting. I'm like, man, I really don't want to cut this holly bush down. I like this holly bush, but it just, the other side never came back. I gave it like 2 years, and I eventually said, it's coming up. God does the same thing. You won't make it if you're half alive and half dead. You won't make it sitting on the fence. How many people fell away from the faith just from COVID? And that wasn't even persecution, no matter what some may say. If people fell away from the faith from COVID, how many will fall away when you might actually get put in prison or die? You won't make it if you're not fully in the kingdom. Persecution weeds out the waivers. Make sure your roots go deeper than the weeds. Number 6, this is last point. This is from verse 32. Those who know their God shall stand firm and take action. I love this statement. I love this. I mean, the chapter 11 is worth it just for that statement. Those who know their God will stand firm and take action. This is a reference, I think, to the Maccabean revolt in 167 to 160 BC. It's during the reign of Antiochus. Now, I want to read a passage, just bear with me, from 1 Maccabees, because this is what I think it refers to. We don't believe the Apocrypha is inspired. We don't believe 1 Maccabees is inspired. But it is helpful in understanding history. Let me read a passage to you from 1 Maccabees that I think this is a reference to. This is referring to the persecution under Antiochus. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and they burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant or anyone who adhered to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on the top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised and their families and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die. That's a true story. Those who know their God will stand firm and take action. Notice he doesn't say experienced Jews. He doesn't say experienced Jews will stand firm. He doesn't say mature Jews. He doesn't say priests or prophets. He simply says those who know their God. You know, if somebody were to ask me, Matt, would you walk through fire for a wife and her children in another country? No. Why? I don't know them. I don't know them. I'm not walking through fire for them. Okay. Would you walk through fire for this wife and these children? Yes. Of course. Why? Because I know them. I know them. Do you know God like that? Do you know God like that? If you do, you will stand firm. You will take action.